Hey, welcome back. Phil 328. This is the week we're talking about cloning. So we're continuing talking about assisted reproductive technologies, focusing here on cloning or reproductive cloning. Now, just to get started here, as Vaughan points out, cloning can mean quite a number of different things. Just the basic idea is making a genetic copy of something. Well, that something doesn't have to be a person, of course. So there's all kinds of cloning and cloning techniques that go on in labs for all kinds of different reasons, cloning cells or, things less than a person, say. And we're not going to deal directly with those. Those are, let's say, relatively uncontroversial. There could be controversy. If there is, it typically has to do with a slippery slope form, whether, say, any kind of cloning techniques or practices could sort of, pave the way toward more controversial reproductive forms of cloning. But anyway, it's on reproductive cloning that we'll focus here, the idea where cloning techniques and so on would be pursued with the eye toward cloning a person, say. Now, the thing about this, of course, is this doesn't exactly go on. Well, it does and it doesn't. As Vaughan will point out, there's two main ways this could go on, and one of them does happen and the other not. The one that does is what he calls, I think, twinning. Sometimes that's called embryo separation or blastomere separation. Or splitting. Basically, that's the idea where you have sort of an egg cell that is fertilized in an ordinary way, a technically sexual way, in a lab probably, of course. And after it splits a couple of times, those cells are separated, thus producing cloned embryos, typically in the context of some other form of ART. So we're not actually going to focus on that either. That kind of does go on. There may be some issues there, but it's the other thing, the so-called somatic cell nuclear transfer method, right? This has more to do with what we'll focus on, where a lot of the debate and the more interesting issues go on. Not because it is actually something that occurs yet, but more whether or not any effort or any moves should be made toward making it more of a reality for human reproduction. It can work in other kinds of animals, but the big question is whether we would ever want any such practice to occur with human reproduction. So, anyway, that's just important to keep in mind, that basically we're thinking about this somewhat in the abstract and thinking about how it would provide, or not provide, but how it would occasion the kind of conflict between, on the one hand, general ideas pertaining to procreative liberty, those who might desire to have a genetically related child, basically, and they might only be able to do so through a cloning technique. There are cases like that. Versus what possible harms or just negative consequences might follow, either at an individual level, probably having to do with the possibly cloned child, or just broader social implications of sometimes along the lines, quite closely in fact, to some of the concerns that were expressed last week, in particular by, say, Ryan. So the text, the last half of that chapter 8 from Vaughan, it's fairly clear, it's fairly useful, lays out the basic ideas and outlines the main arguments. All of this will get looked at in a little more detail in other of the readings. So the first is from Singer. So you'll notice, this it's not it could have been last week, right? It's technically, ostensibly, it's about IVF. And the permissibility of that, and basically just laying out reasons why, well, there's no good reason to oppose it, basically. This may not strike us as all that interesting, and that's largely because IVF has, in the intervening years, become fairly mainstreamed. It's not particularly controversial, but we can just think about how that kind of approach may or may not apply to reproductive cloning, basically, whether the same kinds of reasons. And I would say it probably does, so long as we recognize it. It's a key premise in everything that Singer is saying there, and that is, if we are not going to take any kind of steps or otherwise kind of revise what we think about procreative liberty in general. In general, if we think that that is an important right, and if in general we allow people who are fertile, or people who do not need any ARTs of any sort, if we allow that they can freely go about doing what they want to do in terms of reproduction and procreation, then it would simply just be unfair not to allow those who need some sort of technological assistance to avail themselves of it. So basically just the question whether that would carry over to something like cloning. So that's really interesting to think about in connection with the article from Cass. It's a very well-known article. It's been read and reread many times since it was published originally. So it's very interesting, just firstly in the sense about how he tries to go about expressing his opposition to cloning, and that is, as its title suggests, right, this wisdom of repugnance. He just sort of feels. Right? He feels this deep conviction that somehow it's just got to be wrong, that somehow it just goes too far, and thinks, that's really what it rests on. He does articulate fairly clearly quite a number of reasons and considerations and so on, but he seems just to be a little worried that when you put it onto the terrain of kind of ordinary ethical discourse, he seems to think maybe the dice are kind of loaded, that we've gotten so used to ideas about procreative liberty and about not establishing any limits on that. So along the lines of what Singer was articulating with regard to IVF, that basically it's going to be really hard somehow to put the brakes on this. I mean, he sees really definitely a kind of slippery slope. He doesn't seem to be opposed to things like IVF, though, which is really quite interesting because, as he himself says, people made similar sorts of arguments against it earlier. But nonetheless, he seems to think a certain line is crossed if we were to go further toward cloning, that there's all kinds of negative. You can read the article, you'll see, in terms of a general dehumanizing effect. There's some deep and important meaning about reproduction that simply gets messed around with too much with cloning. There'd be all kinds of negative implications, some of which we can anticipate, some of which no doubt we cannot even anticipate, and he just thinks that's a road we should not go down at all, basically. So the thing to think about here, that may or may not kind of resonate with feelings or ideas that you have about it, but the single biggest question, is just whether or not it is good enough, to sort of rely on feelings of repugnance or revulsion. There's all kinds of things people can feel like that about. And it may or may not really be a valid way of expressing yourself or of trying to get other people to agree with you. There's all kinds of ways that our feelings can get kind of hijacked or be limited by other considerations, which perhaps we should just clarify. We should just try to bring into clearer light and to see and assess what's going on. So it's not necessarily very satisfactory. It may or may not, but it may not be satisfactory to just let it rest at that. It could be dangerous to do that if we can't just make a more sort of clear-cut, sort of rational case. Now, that said, you might find such a case already in there in the things that he says, but nonetheless, it seems that almost all of what he says could be answered by proponents of cloning. But nonetheless, Cass wouldn't want to budge, and he would urge us to just sort of attend to these kind of deeper feelings that it's just too weird or just goes too far, and on those grounds just decline to pursue further research or take any steps toward that. Okay, and then finally there's a piece from Brock. So this is a very nice piece, very useful, quite balanced piece, a discussion of the issues for and against cloning. It may seem a little dated, but it actually holds up fairly well. Things aren't so fundamentally different. I mean, on the scientific, technical side, many things are different, but sort of the broader ethical issues we're concerned with haven't changed all that much. So he considers things from both sides, basically. So on the one hand, he basically wants to say, and this is partly in agreement with people like Robertson, that sure, there is an important sense, an important right to reproduce, or a sense of procreative liberty. He doesn't put as much emphasis on as Robertson does, though, and I think we could put that this way. He doesn't invest so much in the idea of a procreative interest. Basically, Rock wants to say, sure, it's a good thing if people want to have a genetically related child. We do allow that. There are lots of reasons why we might want to encourage people to adopt kids that already exist. Yes. But nonetheless, it is something that we do allow. Other people are free to do it. But basically, Brock seems to be of the view that, well, it's not so important. It's not like we're going to make massive changes just to accommodate that desire. It's a good thing. It is something to take into account, but it doesn't carry as much weight as it did in the eyes of Robertson. And just keep in mind that the only real serious sort of benefits that Brock sees coming from this, both have to do directly with whatever good there might be in individuals being able to have a genetically related child. So always just keep in mind that's a crucial thing, right? That if you might think that it's not so important at all, that maybe that's great when it can happen, and if it can't, that's just too bad. That will change sort of the contours of the debate quite considerably. So on the con side, so opposing the permissibility of cloning, he thinks, well, the main kinds of harms to consider would firstly relate to the child or the cloned child directly, and then more broadly there may be some social concerns. With all of these, though, he just wants to say almost all of them are at least in part based on some misconceptions about just what it would mean to be genetically identical to somebody else. He thinks it shouldn't, and it doesn't necessarily have any huge implications in terms of the individual's life. It's basically no different than being somebody's twin, and nobody thinks those people's lives are terrible or somehow ruined by that fact. So generally, he understands, yes, people like Kaz can talk about these dehumanizing effects, but he doesn't think that that's a very serious worry. There's no good reason to expect those kinds of consequences. Likewise, with the individual, him or herself, the ideas. These are really important, and we'll discuss them on Flipgrid, I think. The ideas about, just the sense of being a unique individual, or the sense of having an open future, basically. Again, he thinks these kinds of worries are misplaced because it just puts way too much emphasis on one's genetic makeup in terms of how one's life unfolds, really. That's just one factor. Other factors are as, if not more, important. So he thinks largely those are just mistaken views. Thing is, though, even if they're mistaken, they could cause some psychological harm. He will allow this, and this is exactly the most important thing we need to take into account, that the child just even thinking, however wrong they might be, that somehow their future is already determined for them, or that somehow they are not a unique individual just because they are genetically identical to somebody else who lived in the past, who may still be alive. This could cause a kind of psychological distress in some way or other, and that is something to take into account. There are some more serious issues that we're going to look at in the next couple of weeks, basically, where we shift from simply someone desiring to have a genetically related child to trying to use some kinds of cloning and technologies to somehow manipulate or otherwise be selective about somehow, say, enhancing somebody's genetic profile. That's a very different thing, and that is worrisome, and there are basically issues there. We'll look at those later, but just in terms of, say, individuals in a more ordinary way trying to bring about a genetically related child, on balance, Brock basically says, well, yes, we're not really sure. There are some pros and cons. There is something good that we do want to, if possible, allow people to have a genetically related child if they happen to so wish. And if cloning is the only way to do it, that may be permissible. We need to think about the possible harms that could befall that individual in terms of their life. It's largely speculative because it hasn't happened, and maybe it never will. But those are some of the issues. Mainly, that's the emphasis we want to put to try to weigh those things off, basically. So anyway, he kind of has a sort of an inconclusive view. Just some more thought has to go into this, possibly some more research. There's no good reason to grind it entirely to a halt, but we do want to be cautious moving forward to make sure that we can find the right balance. And if it turns out that we disallow cloning, that's certainly within the realm of possibility as far as Brock goes. Now I'm going to wrap up.